The war had been going on for 3 long cycles across the broken moons of Prime and Captain. Jake never thought he would find her there bleeding silver blood onto the black sand, with her dragon wrapped around her dying body. Princess Lyra of House was close to death, and the energy blast had ripped through her side, and the ancient magic that kept her people alive was flowing out like starlight through broken glass, and her dragon, named with his dark scales and green glowing eyes, made a sound so sad that it hurt Jake deep in his bones. The princess whispered to him that he should run away because the enemies would come back soon, but Jake had seen too much death in this war already, and he had lost his whole team to the insect-like who wanted to eat every living world. And when Lyra looked at him with her purple eyes, something old woke up inside his chest like he knew her from somewhere. The dragon spoke inside Jake's mind like thunder, and told him that human blood had iron in it in ways that elves did not, and maybe it could help bridge the gap and buy the princess time until they could reach the healing places. Jake did not wait or think about it, and he took out his combat knife and cut open his hand and pressed the bleeding wound against hers, and her skin felt cool like moonlight, but where their blood mixed together heat exploded out, and Lyra's eyes flew open wide and started blazing with silver fire. The bond between them snapped into place like an exploding star inside Jake's mind, and suddenly he could feel everything about her and every thought and every memory and every beat of her 2 hearts. And the scary part was that she could feel him too, and the bond between an elf and a human was against every law her people had, and it could never be undone. His eyes got really wide with shock, and he said it was impossible because the human carried the old blood, and the blood of the first ones who lived long ago. As Lyra's wound started to close up really fast by using Jake's life energy, something else woke up too, and the dragon bond that was meant only for elf people stretched out to include Jake as well, and he gasped when his ancient mind touched his own and shared memories of wars that happened before humans even left their caves. Lyra asked what he had done, but her voice sounded full of wonder, and not angry, and silver veins traced up Jake's arm where their blood had mixed, and they glowed softly under his skin. Far away, the clicking screams of the swarm got closer, but Jake could feel through the bond that everything had changed now, and Lyra's wound was healed, and was not tired anymore. And the most amazing thing was that Jake could feel the dragon's fire building in his own chest, and he could sense the ancient fighting patterns flowing from Lyra's warrior training into his own muscles. Said the legends spoke of this, and when an elf and human bonded in blood and purpose, and when a dragon accepted both of them, the old books called them, and they were warriors who could change the fate of empires. Lyra stood up with silver blood still shining on her armor, and she held out her hand to Jake and told him they wanted to stop this from happening, and that was why they attacked her diplomatic mission, because they knew what might happen if their peoples truly joined together. Jake took her hand and felt the bond pulse between them like a living thing made of power and promise, and he said then they should show what they were afraid of. As the swarm came over the ridge spread his huge wings, and for the first time in 10,000 years, a dragon carried both an elf and a human into battle together, and the war for Prime was about to change forever. Jake could feel Lyra's presence in his mind like a warm, constant thing, and it made his own thoughts feel less lonely, and he realized he had never felt so connected to another person in his whole life, and through the bond he could sense that she felt the same way. The silver veins on both their arms glowed brighter as they flew, and told them through the mind link that they needed to be careful because the bond was new and untested, and they did not know what limits it had or what price it might demand from them later. Below them, they gathered in massive numbers, and their chittering sounds filled the air like a horrible song, and Jake felt fear rise up in him. But then he felt Lyra's courage flow through the bond and push his fear away, and he sent his own human stubbornness back to her, and together they felt stronger than either of them could alone. dove toward the swarm, and Jake raised his hand without thinking, and silver fire burst from his palm just like it did from Lyra's, and he shaped it into a blade that hummed with power. And when the first jumped at them, he cut through its armor like it was paper. Lyra fought beside him, and their movements were perfectly matched even though they had never trained together. And every time Jake needed to dodge, Lyra was already moving to cover that spot. And every time she needed support, his fire was already there, burning through enemies. The bond let them fight like one person in two bodies, and they had never seen anything like it before. And their hive mind could not predict what Jake and Lyra would do next, because they moved with human creativity and elven grace all mixed together. After the fight ended, and the retreated, Jake and Lyra stood breathing hard and looking at each other. And through the bond, they both felt the same thought, that this was just the beginning and they had started something that would change everything. Landed beside them and said they needed to go back to the human and elf fleets and tell them what happened, because if they did not work together, the main swarm would destroy both their peoples. Jake looked at the silver veins on his arms and felt the bond humming between him and Lyra, and he knew their lives would never be the same, and he also knew that he would not change what happened even if he could, because saving her had been the right thing to do. Lyra smiled at him, and through the bond he felt her agreement and her determination to make their peoples see that unity was not weakness but strength, and together they climbed onto his back and flew toward the waiting fleets. The dragon rose into the sky and carried them away from the battlefield and toward an uncertain future. But Jake did not feel afraid anymore, because he was not alone, and neither was Lyra. And whatever came next, they would face it together as partners bonded in blood and purpose and magic. The Terran command ship called Valiant hung in space like a huge steel building, and Jake was about to do something that every military rule book said was treason. And he stood in the docking bay with Lyra beside him, and her presence in his mind was a constant warm feeling that made his thoughts feel less lonely, and waited outside on the far landing area, because he was too big to fit inside, and his scales shimmered with barely hidden impatience. Lyra told Jake through their mind connection that the military leaders would punish him for what he did, and Jake felt her real concern wrapped around her fierce determination through the bond. Jake said they could try to punish him, and his hand moved without thinking to touch his weapon, and the silver veins that now went up both his arms were impossible to hide, and they glowed softly through his uniform sleeves, and every human soldier in the bay was staring at him. Admiral Kate walked through the crowd, and her gray hair was pulled back tight, and her face looked like it was carved from stone, and she had led the Terran military forces for 20 years, and had never lost a big fight, and she had no patience for what she called getting involved with aliens. The Admiral told Jake to step away from the hostile alien, but Jake said Lyra was not hostile, and she was Princess Lyra of House, and her people had been fighting for hundreds of years, and they should be natural allies. Looked closely at the glowing veins on Jake's arms, and asked what happened to him. Through the bond, Jake felt Lyra's flash of anger at being called hostile, and then her quiet amusement at his instinct to defend her, and he could feel her reaching out with her senses, and counting the positions of every soldier and every weapon, and calculating the odds with the cool precision of someone trained for war since childhood. Jake explained that he saved her life, and she saved his, and they were bonded now, and he had seen their information about and the Admiral needed to know that they had only been fighting the scout troops, and the actual swarm had not even arrived yet. A wave of worry passed through the gathered soldiers, and his jaw got tight, and she told him to explain what he meant. Lyra stepped forward and moved with that strange grace that made her seem to float instead of walk, and she told them the moved in waves, and first they sent harvesters to weaken a star system and feed on stragglers and study defenses, and then the true swarm came with billions of them, led by their hive mothers, and they had eaten 14 civilizations in the past 1,000 years. Jake added that they were coming here and they had already started the harvest, and his team was not killed in a random fight. But it was a planned attack because they were testing human response times and weapons and tactics. Was quiet for a long moment, and her tactical mind was clearly working through what this meant, and finally she asked why Lyra bonded with Jake and what that accomplished. Lyra smiled sharp like broken glass and told Jake to show them. Jake did not need to think about it because the bond carried instinct now and muscle memory that was not his own, and he moved, and Lyra moved with him in perfect sync. And they had never trained together or even practiced fighting, but their bodies flowed through an ancient elf combat pattern that looked like a deadly dance, and Jake's human strength, paired with Lyra's supernatural speed, created something neither could do alone. But that was not the stunning part, because Jake raised his hand and silver fire erupted from his palm, the same color as Lyra's blood, and the same burning magic that powered her people's greatest weapons, and he shaped it into a blade that was solid and humming with power, and then he made it disappear with just a thought. The bay fell completely silent. Lieutenant Amy, who was the ship's science officer and had pushed to the front of the crowd, said it was impossible because humans did not have the genetic markers for psychic manipulation, and they could not touch magic. Jake said quietly that they could not do it until now, and the bond changed something in both of them, and Lyra could feel what he felt and react to threats before her conscious mind registered them. And it was human instinct paired with elf reflexes, and he held up his glowing arm and said he could channel her power and use magic that should be impossible for his species. Through the bond he felt Lyra add silently that she could draw on his endurance and his human stubbornness, and his refusal to die when all logic said he should, and they were stronger together than apart. Admiral studied them both with the calculating look of someone who had survived 30 years of military politics, and she said if what they were saying was true, and if the main swarm was coming, they needed every advantage, but command would never authorize this because the Elven sovereignty and the Terran alliance had barely spoken in centuries, and they would call this a contamination. Lyra said then they needed to prove it worked, and there was a harvester nest on the third moon of Prime, and it was large enough to be a real threat but small enough to attack with a strike team, and they should lead it and let humans and elves fight together and show both their peoples what was possible. Looked at Jake and told him he understood what he was asking, and if this went wrong, she could not protect him, and even if it went right, there would be trials and investigations and politicians screaming about unauthorized contact, and his career was over. Jake thought about his team, and about the Marines who had died screaming as harvesters tore them apart, and he thought about the look in Lyra's eyes when she thought she was dying, and the loneliness of a princess far from home, fighting a war her people were slowly losing, and he thought about ancient memories of civilizations falling to the swarm and worlds reduced to empty dead rocks. Through the bond, Lyra's presence wrapped around his thoughts like armor, and she whispered in his mind that they would face whatever came together. Jake said his career had been over since the moment he cut his hand open, but maybe they could save a few million lives before the military kicked him out. Admiral's lips moved in what might have been almost a smile, and she told Lieutenant to put together a mixed strike team with volunteers only, and she told Jake he had 48 hours to prove this bond was worth the political nightmare it was going to create. As they turned to leave, Jake felt something else through the bond, and it was approval that felt ancient and vast as a mountain range, because the dragon had been listening to everything, and outside in the cold, empty space, he spread his wings in a gesture that every dragon rider would recognize as a declaration. The hunt was beginning, and Jake and Lyra would lead humans and elves into battle together for the first time in recorded history. And through the bond they both felt the same mixture of fear and hope and determination that maybe, just maybe, they could save both their peoples from the coming darkness. The third moon of Prime was a dead place, and its surface was covered with the geometric precision of digging patterns, and Jake crouched behind a ridge of twisted metal, with his strike team spread out on both sides, and there were 4 human marines and 3 elven blade dancers and Lyra, who commanded them all with a quiet authority that went beyond species. Through the bond, Jake felt Lyra's tactical mind working and processing angles and distances, and counting the harvesters that scuttled through the nest below, and there were more than intelligence reports had said, and there were always more. Lyra's thought brushed his mind and told him there were 27 visible contacts, and likely twice that many in the deeper chambers, and the nest was mature so they would have a sub-queen. Jake passed the information to Corporal Maya, who was his second in command, by using hand signals, and Maya's dark eyes looked at Lyra, and then back to Jake, and trust and uncertainty fought on her face, and the other Marines named Danny Wright and Lisa looked equally torn because they had volunteered for this mission, but volunteering to fight alongside aliens was different from actually doing it. The 3 elven blade dancers named and Sira and Finn showed no hesitation because they had served under Lyra for years and had watched their princess nearly die on the planet's surface. And if she trusted this human enough to bond with him, that was good enough for them. Above them circled in silence, and his massive body was barely visible against the stars, and through Jake's bond with Lyra, he could feel the dragon's presence like a distant thunderstorm that was patient and deadly. Sira whispered that they were building something, and her voice carried an accent that reminded Jake of wind chimes, and she pointed to the nest center where harvesters were putting together a structure made of resin and stolen technology, and she said it was a broadcast spire, and if they finished it, they could call the main swarm. Lyra's hand found Jake's shoulder, and the physical contact made the bond stronger until he could see through her eyes, and centuries of combat experience flooded his nervous system, and she said they had to go now and hit them fast and brutal, and not let them coordinate. Jake felt the silver fire building in his chest, and it was responding to Lyra's will and to their combined determination, and he had practiced with it over the past 2 days and learned to shape it into weapons and shields and raw destructive force, and it felt right in a way that nothing else in his life ever had, like some sleeping part of his DNA had finally woken up. Jake told the strike team to move out. They hit the nest like a silver storm, and Lyra moved first with her twin blades singing through the air, and each strike was precise enough to cut through a harvester's nerve center, and the blade dancers followed with their movements synchronized through years of training and creating a deadly protective circle. Jake and the Marines came behind them and provided covering fire with plasma rifles, while Jake channeled silver fire from his palms and burned through shell armor that should have resisted human weapons, and the bond let him anticipate Lyra's movements and position himself where she needed support and create openings for her strikes. Lyra's thought arrived in his mind a split second before his conscious mind registered the threat and told him 3 enemies were coming from the left side, and he pivoted and raised a shield of silver fire that caught the harvester's acid spray, and then he collapsed it into a spear that punched through all 3 bodies in quick succession. Through the bond he felt Lyra's fierce approval and her pride in how quickly he had learned, and something else too, which was the realization that she was no longer fighting alone, and no longer carrying the weight of her people's survival on her shoulders by herself. The harvesters adapted quickly like they always did, and they began targeting Jake specifically, because they recognized him as something unusual and a threat that did not match any tactical database, and a wave of them surged forward with their mandibles clicking, and their hive-mind coordination turning them from individuals into a single deadly organism. Chose that moment to dive down from above. The dragon hit the nest like a meteor wrapped in midnight scales and green fire, and his roar shattered the harvester's coordination, because the psychic weight of it crushed their hive-mind connection, and dragons were natural predators to the so far above them in the food chain that every instinct screamed to run away. But Jake felt something else through his unexpected bond with, and it was recognition, because the dragon saw something in the harvester's pattern, and something in the way they moved and built, An ancient voice rumbled through Jake's mind like thunder, and told him these were scouts for something worse, and they had to destroy the spire now. Jake did not question the dragon, and he ran toward the structure at the nest's center with Lyra, packing him stride for stride, and their movements were perfectly synchronized, and the marines and blade dancers formed a corridor, and held back the harvester's swarm with desperate precision. The spire pulsed with organic technology, and it was already half complete and already beginning to send its signal into deep space, and Jake could feel it calling and beckoning, and promising the main swarm that this star system was ready for harvest. Lyra said they had to do this together, and her hand found his, and silver fire erupted from both of them, and merged into something greater than either could produce alone, and the beam struck the spire, and it screamed with a sound that existed as much in the mind as in reality. Then it exploded. The blast wave knocked them both backward, and Jake's armor took most of it, but he felt ribs crack and tasted blood, and through the bond he felt Lyra's pain mirroring his own, and felt her frantic assessment of his injuries even as she struggled to get up. The harvesters were retreating now and scuttling back into deeper tunnels, because without the spire and without coordination, they were just animals, and dangerous animals, but animals nonetheless. Landed beside them, and his great head lowered to look at Jake with eyes that held intelligence older than human civilization, and he told Jake through the bond that he had fought well, and called him little, but this was only the beginning, because he had felt what the spire was calling, and the main swarm was closer than they thought. Maya asked how close while helping Jake to his feet, and the corporal had a cut across her forehead, but her eyes were steady. Lyra closed her eyes, and her elf senses reached out across the empty space, and when she opened them again, Jake felt her fear through the bond, and it was cold and absolute, and she said 3 weeks or maybe 4 and they were already in the star system, and slowing down, and by the time their governments agreed to coordinate, and by the time both their peoples stopped arguing about jurisdiction and contamination, it would be too late. Jake finished her sentence and said it would be too late, and he looked at his strike team with humans and elves who were bloodied but alive, and who had just fought together, and he said they should not wait for permission, and they should show everyone what they found here and what they could do together, and make them listen. Admiral's voice came over the communication system, because she had been monitoring the entire operation, and she told Jake to get his team back to the Valiant and bring the princess, because it was time they had a conversation with the Elven sovereignty, whether they wanted one or not. As they loaded onto the transport ship's voice rumbled through Jake's mind one final time, and told him the old text spoke of times when their peoples stood together against the dark, and when humans and elves were not separate but parts of a greater whole, and perhaps those times were returning, and perhaps they must if any of them were to survive what was coming. Jake looked at Lyra, and at the silver veins that now marked them both, and at the bond that made them something new, and something neither human nor elf but both. He said quietly that they should come, and they would be ready. The sovereignty throne ship called Eternal Dawn hung in space like a crystal palace, and it was beautiful and completely alien, and Jake had never imagined he would step onto an elf capital ship, and much less stand before the High Council with silver veins glowing on his arms, and a princess's presence constant in his mind. Lyra's thought carried warmth and steadiness, and told him to breathe, because they would test him and her mother especially, and he should show no fear. Through the bond Jake felt Lyra's own nervousness that was carefully hidden beneath centuries of royal training, and she stood beside him in full ceremonial armor that was silver and blue, and every inch the warrior princess. But inside she was afraid, and not of thee or battle, but of what her own people might do to this strange thing they had become. The council chamber was huge, and its walls were decorated with living light that shifted through colors no human language had names for, and 12 elf nobles sat in judgment, and they were ancient beings who had lived through the rise and fall of empires, and at the center on a throne of woven starlight sat Queen Myra of House. She was Lyra's mother. The queen was beautiful in the way a sword is beautiful and perfect and deadly, and completely without warmth, and her purple eyes, so much like her daughters, studied Jake, with the intensity of someone examining a contaminated sample. Queen Myra's voice carried the weight of authority earned across 10 centuries, and she asked if this was the human who had corrupted her daughter's bloodline. Jake felt Lyra stiffen beside him and felt her anger spark through the bond, but he squeezed her hand gently and silently asked her to let him speak. Jake said with respect that he saved her daughter's life, and the bond was not intentional, but it had proven effective, and they destroyed a harvester nest and prevented a broadcast spire from summoning the main swarm, and the Terran alliance and the Elven sovereignty needed to work together, or they would both fall. High Counselor stood up, and his white hair flowed like a waterfall, and he asked if Jake presumed to lecture them on and said they had fought the swarm for 1,000 years, while humans were still discovering fire, and what could humans possibly offer them? Jake felt the answer through the bond, and drew on Lyra's memories even as he spoke with his own voice, and he said they had been fighting the same way for 1,000 years, and they had been losing, and slowly and steadily, system by system, because they were predictable, and they relied on magic and on dragon riders, and on tactics that worked against the last swarm, but they adapted and learned and evolved. He raised his glowing arm and said this should not be possible with a human and elf bonded, and a human channeling elf magic, and it broke every rule, and that was exactly why it worked, because they did not have tactics for this, and they could not predict it, and could not adapt to it, because it had never existed before. Through the bond Jake felt Lyra's fierce pride and her determination flowing into him like steel, and she stepped forward beside him and addressed the council directly. Lyra told her mother and the honored counselors that she understood their concerns, and the bond was unprecedented, and it violated ancient taboos, but she was still their princess and still a warrior of house, and she was telling them now that Jake was no corruption, and he was the key to their survival. Queen Myra's expression did not change, but Jake felt something shift in the chamber's atmosphere, and several counselors were leaning forward now, with interest fighting against outrage on their ageless faces. The queen commanded them to demonstrate and show what this bond provided that their warriors did not already possess. Lyra nodded to Jake, and together they moved to the chamber's center, and through the bond they did not need to speak or plan, because Jake felt Lyra's intentions as if they were his own, and responded before conscious thought. They fought an opponent that was not there, and moved through combat patterns that blended elf precision with human unpredictability, and Jake channeled silver fire, and shaped it into weapons that shifted form mid-strike and created openings that Lyra exploited with her physical blades, and she drew on his endurance and maintained speed and intensity that would exhaust even an elf, and he drew on her centuries of experience, and his body flowed through techniques he had never learned but somehow knew. The dance lasted 3 minutes, and when they finished Jake was barely tired and Lyra was smiling, and it was the first genuine smile he had felt from her since they boarded the Eternal Dawn. The council chamber was silent. Finally, High Counselor spoke, and her voice was thoughtful, and she said she had trained warriors for 6 centuries, and what she just witnessed with that synchronization, and that seamless integration of different fighting styles should take decades to achieve, and they did it in days. Jake explained that they did not have to learn each other's movements because they felt them, and the bond made them extensions of each other. And it was not just combat but strategic planning, and tactical assessment and resource allocation, and everything moved faster when 2 minds worked as one. Queen Myra said quietly that it also made them vulnerable because if one of them was compromised, both were at risk, and if one died, she left the sentence unfinished. But Jake felt Lyra's flash of fear through the bond, because neither of them knew what would happen if their bond was severed by death, and the ancient texts did not say, and no elf-human pair had ever existed long enough to find out. Before Jake could respond, alarms screamed through the ship, and the walls flickered, and the living light shifted to angry red, and a holographic display erupted in the chamber's center, showing the space around Prime. The swarm had arrived. Not in 3 weeks and not in 4, but now. Admiral's face appeared on the display, and her granite composure was cracking, and she said, "All ships, this is Terran Command, and the main swarm has emerged from hyperspace, and confirmed count was over 12,000 capital class and hundreds of thousands of harvester craft, and they were heading directly for Prime's inhabited colonies." Queen Myra stood, and for the first time Jake saw fear in her ancient eyes, and she said, "By the light, there are too many, and even with their full fleet they could not win." Jake said quietly that they could not win alone, and neither could the humans, but together maybe they had a chance. He felt Lyra's hand find his and felt her presence in his mind strengthen and resolve hardening, and she told her mother they did not have time for more debate, and asked her to give command of the combined fleet's vanguard and let her take bonded pairs into battle because they could turn this. Looked stunned and asked about bonded pairs, and if she thought others would accept this contamination. Lyra shot back that they would if they wanted to live, and her father had told her the old stories and the legends of, and they thought they were myths, but Jake and she were proof. And if they could bond, others could too, with volunteers from both their peoples fighting as one. Through the bond, Jake felt her reaching out to Admiral through the communication channel, and felt the human officer's surprise at the psychic contact, and then her grim acceptance. Said her Marines would volunteer, and the ones who fought at the Harvester Nest, and they had seen what Jake and Lyra could do, and they understood what was at stake. Queen Myra looked at her daughter for a long moment, and in that gaze Jake glimpsed 1,000 years of history, and of losses and triumphs, and of a mother watching her child walk into fire, and finally the queen nodded. She said, "Very well," and Princess Lyra would command the vanguard of Storm, and take her human warriors and bond them if they were willing, but understand this, and if they failed, and if this bond proved false, they would have doomed both their peoples. Lyra stood and was both warrior and princess, and she said then they would not fail. As they left the council chamber, Jake felt's presence through the bond, and the dragon's ancient voice carrying weight and warning, and he told them the swarm had come in greater numbers than any previous cycle, and they had learned that humans and elves occupied this system, and they meant to crush them before they could become what they feared most. Jake thought back and asked what they feared. Said unity, and the old texts said they were created as weapons and bred to divide and conquer, and they existed to exploit species that fought alone, but when civilizations truly joined, and when they became something new, the dragon trailed off, but Jake understood, and they had spent 10,000 years preventing exactly what he and Lyra represented, and now finally they faced it. Lyra asked how long they had, and spoke the question through the bond to both Jake and the Admiral's response was grim, and she said the swarm was slowing down and positioning for orbital bombardment in 48 hours before they reached firing range of the inhabited colonies, and they needed to stop them before that. Jake looked at Lyra and felt her determination through the bond, and felt her fear and hope and desperate love for her people, and he felt the same for his own, and in that moment he understood what they had to do. He said then they should give the war they had never seen before. The vanguard of Storm launched from the eternal dawn like silver daggers into the dark, and there were 12 ships with 6 Terran destroyers and 6 Elven blade cruisers, and each one carried warriors who had chosen to step into legend, and Jake stood on the bridge of the Resolute, which was his command ship, and watched the swarm fill the like a living nightmare. 12,000, and the number did not capture the horror of it, and the way they moved like a single organism, and the way their organic hulls pulsed with corrupt purpose, and each ship was a kilometer of shell and acid and groan, rather than built and filled with thousands of harvesters eager to feed. Through the bond, Jake felt Lyra aboard the elven flagship called Star's Edge, and felt her drawing strength from him, even as she steadied her own warriors, and beyond both of them ancient and vast flew with a wing of dragon riders, and every elf was mounted on drakes that burned with emerald fire. Lyra's thought carried love and fear in equal measure, and asked if he was ready. Jake thought back honestly that he was not ready, but they should do this anyway. On the Resolute's bridge stood 9 humans and 8 elves, and they were bonded pairs who had chosen the transformation in the past 48 hours, and Corporal Maya partnered with the Blade Dancer and Private Danny Wright with Sierra and Lieutenant Amy with Finn, and each pair glowed with silver veins, and each carried the same impossible connection that Jake and Lyra shared. Jake's voice carried across the Vanguard fleet to both human and elf ships, and he said the thought they understood them, and they had studied humans and fought elves for 1,000 years, and they knew their tactics and weapons and limitations. He looked at Maya, and standing together with their minds linked, and their movements already synchronized, and he said, but they had never fought them, and they did not have a protocol for what they had become, and they could not predict what happened when 2 minds shared one purpose. Through the bond, Lyra added her voice and spoke to both fleets at the same time, and she said the swarm moved as one, and they thought this was their strength, but it was also their weakness, and if they struck the hive nodes and disrupted their coordination, they would become confused and vulnerable, and they did not need to destroy 12,000 ships, but just needed to cut off their head. Admiral's voice cut in from the Terran command carrier, and said confirmed, and intelligence identified 7 hive mother vessels at the swarm's core, and each one controlled roughly 1,700, and if they killed the mothers, they killed the swarm's coordination. Queen Myra's voice followed and was transmitted from the Eternal Dawn, and she said easier said than done, because no force had ever penetrated to the swarm's core, and the outer shells were too dense, and they would be torn apart. Jake felt's ancient presence surge through the bond and carry memories that were not his own, and he saw through the dragon's eyes a battle 10,000 years ago when dragons and elves fought for the first time, and he saw the old tactics and the way dragon riders had once broken swarm formations. Jake said with respect that the Queen's forces had never had humans flying with them, and they had never had bonded warriors who could coordinate like a hive mind themselves. He pulled up a tactical display and felt Lyra's strategic mind working with his own, and 2 thought processes blending into something greater, and the plan formed between them, and neither quite his nor hers, but born from their connection. They would split into 3 groups, and Vanguard 1 would draw the swarm's attention and make them commit their outer shells, and Vanguard 2, with dragon riders, would punch through the gap they created, and Vanguard 3, which was Lyra and Jake with the other bonded pairs, would ride with the dragons and go straight for the hive mothers. His voice carried disbelief, and said they would be outnumbered 1,000 to 1. Lyra agreed and said yes, but they had never faced coordinated telepathic assault before, and the bonded pairs could share tactical information instantly and adjust to threats before they materialized, and they could fight like they did as a single organism, except they could think independently and adapt and do things the enemy could not predict. There was a long pause, and Jake felt the weight of it and felt thousands of lives hanging on this decision, and then Admiral laughed with a harsh bark of sound. She said, well, hell, and they were already dead if they sat there, and at least this way they went down fighting, and Terran Defense Corps would volunteer for Vanguard 1, and they should show these bugs what happened when you made humanity angry. Queen Myra was slower to respond, but when she did, her voice carried the weight of acceptance, and she said House would lead the dragon riders, and she told her daughter that if she failed, and if she fell, the Queen left it unfinished. Lyra's voice was soft through the bond, but Jake felt her resolve like iron, and she said she knew, but if they succeeded, they saved both their peoples, and was that not worth any risk? The Queen commanded to launch all fighters, and may the light guide them, and she called Lyra. The battle began. Vanguard 1 hit the swarm's outer edge like a hammer, and Terran destroyers and Elven blade cruisers worked in concert, and plasma fire and silver magic tore through the first wave of. And they responded exactly as planned, and they committed reserves and pulled their formations tight and were determined to crush this resistance. Through the bond, Jake felt every element of the battle filtered through Lyra's tactical mind, and he saw where gaps would form before they appeared, and where the swarm would overextend, and the bonded pairs worked as relay points, and each one sharing information and creating a network of awareness that spanned the battlefield. Jake commanded Vanguard 2 to go. Led the charge, and 200 dragon riders followed in his wake, and they burned through the gap in the swarm's formation. An emerald fire melted shell, and ancient magic tore through biological shields, and they tried to close the gap, but they were too slow, and the dragons moved like silver lightning, too fast and too coordinated. Jake told Vanguard 3 to come with him. His strike team, with 6 bonded pairs on small fast ships, followed in the dragon's wake, and they wove through the swarm's interior, and each pilot moved with their partner's guidance, and seeing threats through shared consciousness before sensors could register them. A harvester wing descended on Danny and Sira's ship, but Sira saw the attack through Danny's spatial awareness and felt his human pattern recognition predicting their approach vector, and they dodged with impossible precision and returned fire with weapons that combined human technology and elf magic. The Hive Mothers loomed ahead, and they were massive beyond comprehension, and each one was 5 kilometers of pulsing flesh and bioengineered technology, and each one was a node of the swarm's collective intelligence. Through the bond, Jake felt Lyra's ship pull alongside his own and flew above them, and his mind linking with both of theirs, and creating a triad of consciousness that burned like a star. All three thought as one, and they thought together. They hit the first Hive Mother with everything they had, and silver fire erupted from the bonded pairs, and each one channeling power that should have been impossible, and the other dragon riders followed and focused their assault on a single point, and the Hive Mother's shields buckled and her biological armor cracking. Then they felt it, and it was the scream. The Hive Mother's death cry echoed across every level of consciousness, both psychic and audible, and throughout the swarm 1700 suddenly stopped moving, and their coordination severed, and their purpose lost. Amy's voice cracked with exhaustion and triumph, and she said it worked and the swarm was fragmenting. But 6 Hive Mothers remained, and now they knew what they faced. The swarm's tactics changed instantly, and began moving independently and abandoning hive coordination for individual survival, and it made them less efficient but also less predictable. Maya shouted as a cluster of harvesters swarmed her ship, and tactical mind worked through her reflexes and helped her dodge, but there were too many. Jake felt it through the network of bonded pairs, and they were getting overwhelmed, and 6 bonded pairs and 200 dragon riders against thousands of individual hostile ships, and they had broken the swarm's coordination, but in doing so they had created chaos. Then spoke, and his ancient voice carried across every bonded mind, and he told them to remember what they were, and not human, and not elf, but something new, and something that did not fight alone. And Jake understood, and the bonded pairs were not just linked to their partners, but through the bond network they were linked to each other in 17 minds, all connected, and all sharing one purpose. He opened himself fully to the network, and felt Lyra do the same, and every bonded pair connected, and their consciousnesses overlapping and creating something that had never existed before, which was a human-elven hive mind, and coordinated like the but adaptable and creative and individually intelligent. They moved as one organism, and 6 ships became extensions of a single tactical intelligence. And when harvesters attacked Maya's ship, Jake was already providing covering fire, because he felt the threat through Maya's connection too. And when Danny needed to reload, Sira's ship covered him, because Amy had predicted the gap through Finn's strategic assessment. They tore through the swarm's interior like a silver knife, and each move perfectly coordinated, and each pilot supporting the others without conscious thought, and for the first time in their existence faced an enemy that could match their hive mind and exceed it. One by one the hive mothers fell. The second died to a concentrated assault from all 6 bonded ships. The third to himself, who burned through its core with emerald fire, while the bonded pairs kept the escorts busy. The fourth and fifth fell nearly at the same time, as the bonded network learned to split its consciousness and fight on multiple fronts at once. But the sixth hive mother was different and older and more intelligent, and it had watched the others die and had learned from each death, and it retreated into the swarm's heart and surrounded itself with layers of protection that even the bonded network could not easily penetrate. And Jake's ship was running out of power, and through the network he felt the same exhaustion in every bonded pair, and they had been fighting for 6 hours and channeling magic and consciousness beyond their normal limits, and the silver veins on his arms were burning, and his human body pushed past any reasonable endurance. Lyra's thought carried desperation, and said they could not maintain this much longer, and another hour, maybe less, and the bond network would start breaking down. Jake thought back that then they should end it now, and through the network he felt every bonded pair's agreement, and they were done being tactical, and it was time to be what the old legends spoke of and be. Jake said all ships should do full assault on the final hive mother, and throw everything they had at her shields, and they were going to crack them even if it killed them. They converged from 6 directions, and every weapon firing, and every ounce of magic channeled into a single coordinated strike, and the hive mother's shields held for 3 seconds, and then 5, and then, with a sound like reality breaking, they shattered. Roared, and his wing of dragon riders followed him through the breach, and Jake and Lyra flew side by side, and their ships so close, they were nearly touching, and the bond between them burning like a supernova. The hive mother's interior was a nightmare of organic technology and poolsing flesh and biomechanical systems that understanding but Jake and Lyra did not need to understand, and they just needed to find the core and the consciousness that directed it all. They found her in a chamber of crystallized acid and neural tissue, and it was a being older than human civilization and intelligent and utterly alien. And through the bond network Jake felt her thoughts that were vast and cold and utterly convinced of her own superiority. The hive mother's consciousness pressed against theirs and told them their unity would not save them, and they had consumed thousands of civilizations, and this was nothing new and just another failed experiment in cooperation. Jake thought back that maybe that was true, but they were the experiment that was about to kill her. He and Lyra fired together, and their weapons synchronized perfectly, and silver fire and plasma merged and tore through the hive mother's core, and she screamed, and the scream echoed across the swarm and across the entire battlefield. And then she died. The remaining ships, with thousands of them, stopped moving, and without the hive mother's coordination, and without any central intelligence, they were just animals, and dangerous animals, but animals that could be hunted down systematically. The Battle of Prime was over. Through the shattered bond network Jake felt the other pair's exhaustion, and their relief and their disbelief that they had survived, and he felt Lyra beside him, and her presence a warm constant in his mind, and ancient approval wrapping around them both. Admiral's voice carried wonder and fatigue in equal measure, and she said confirmed kill on all hive mothers, and the swarm was broken, and they did it, and they actually did it. Queen Myra's voice followed and told them to return to the eternal dawn, all of them, and there would be time for analysis later, but for now they had earned their rest, and she called them. As they flew back through the debris field and past the scattered remnants of the swarm, Jake felt Lyra's thought brush his mind, private and intimate. She asked what they would do now because they had broken every rule and changed everything, and both their peoples would have questions and demands and fears about what they had become. Jake looked at the silver veins on his arms and felt the bond humming between them, and felt the presence of every other bonded pair in his consciousness. He thought back that they would show everyone what was possible and prove that unity was not weakness, and that becoming something new did not mean losing what they were, and they saved both their peoples today, and that was a pretty good start. Through the bond he felt Lyra's laughter warm and full of life, and she asked just to start, and what did he have in mind? Jake thought back everything and his human stubbornness mixing with her elf determination, and they were still out there and other swarms and other threats, but now they knew how to fight them, and now they knew what they could become when they stopped being separate peoples and started being something greater. Ahead the eternal dawn and the Valiant hung in space side by side in two flagships that had never been meant to fight together, but now flew as allies, and on both ships humans and elves watched the vanguards return, and in that watching something fundamental shifted in both civilizations. The age of separation was ending. The age of was beginning. And at its heart, a human warrior and an elf princess, bonded in blood and purpose, flying home together through the stars.